Rōgishō. The real name of the old geisha is Hirade Sonoko, but like the registered names of kabuki actors, it doesn't quite suit the person herself. On the other hand, using only her professional name, Sono, feels incongruous with the dignity she now exudes, as she gradually returns to the unadorned sensibilities of a layperson. Thus, it seems more fitting to simply refer to her as the old geisha. People often see her in the middle of the day at department stores. She wears her hair in an understated Western style, pairs a modest kimono with an air of respectability, and walks around the store with a young girl in tow, her face marked by melancholy. Her tall, stout frame hangs her hands limply at her sides, and her steps seem as though they are cast forward without aim. She loops around the same area repeatedly, only to suddenly stretch herself like a kite string and end up standing still at some unexpected, distant counter. She is aware of nothing but the loneliness of the midday hour. Even the act of soothing herself with the solitude of midday is something she is not conscious of. When an item catches her attention and stirs her from her dreamy state, her bluish, elongated eyes gently open, gazing at the object as if it were a peony in a dream. Her lips, as in her girlhood, curl slightly upwards and draw to one side, where a faint smile flickers. Then she returns to her melancholy. However, when she returned to her professional environment and encountered a worthy rival, her expression would initially appear somewhat absent-minded, only for her to begin speaking with boundless vivacity moments later. In the days when the former proprietress of Shinkaraku was still alive, she, the old geisha, and another from Shimbashi's Hisago district would occasionally gather at the same table. When they began chatting, they would engage in the kind of witty and imaginative conversation that seemed quintessential to their world. Even seasoned geisha of considerable age would leave their own guests, saying, "Let's learn how to speak like them," and gather around the older women. Even when alone, the old geisha would often share tales of her experiences for the benefit of younger colleagues she liked. She would start with stories from her early days as a naive apprentice, such as the time she laughed so hard at the crude jokes exchanged between guests and senior geisha in a parlor that she had an accident on the tatami and ended up crying because she couldn't leave the room. Then, there were tales of her kept woman days, like the time she eloped with a lover and her patron took her mother hostage in retaliation. Even after she became a top-tier geisha with 2 or 3 protégés under her wing, she still struggled behind the scenes. She once took a rickshaw from Yokohama to borrow 5 yen in cash, despite the 12 yen fare being due at the end of the month. Though the content of her stories remained similar, she constantly altered their presentation. Her tales captivated young geisha, drawing them in with a mysterious allure, as if her charm unconsciously ensnared them like a predator's claws. To an observer, it might seem as though she envied their youth and cleverly tormented them through her cunning wit. The young geisha would eventually collapse in laughter, clutching their sides and gasping. "Please, big sister, we beg you, stop. If you make us laugh any more, we'll die." The old geisha never spoke about the living, but when it came to those she had known who had passed away, she offered her own unique and revealing observations. Among the subjects of her anecdotes were not only geisha but also unexpected amateurs and artists. When the famous Chinese actor Mei Lanfang came to perform at the Imperial Theatre, the old geisha once asked a certain wealthy man, who had been involved in arranging his visit, to help her by securing a private audience with Mei, regardless of the cost. This story, whether true or not, became one of her many anecdotes. One of the geisha who had been thoroughly amused by her stories, in a spirit of playful revenge, asked, "Did you really, At that time, take out a bank book from your obi and show that you had money to that man, like they say. The old geisha responded. Ridiculous. I'm no child, what would I be doing with a bank book in my obi? She pouted in mock indignation, like a child. The truth of the story aside, young women often asked her such questions just to witness this rare display of naive attitude. After sharing many stories, she continued. However, you girls, she said, no matter how many men you go through, in the end, you're just looking for one man. She thought back, reflecting on her past. When you look back now, all the men you've been involved with, each one is just a fragment, a piece of the man you've been searching for. That's why none of them could last long. The young geisha, curious, asked, and the man you're looking for, is he someone who exists already? If I knew that clearly, she answered, I wouldn't be struggling so. She spoke with the melancholy beauty of someone who lives in the present, with an air of resignation, as if the man she longed for was both her first love and a man she might yet find in the future. Then, she added, in contrast, I envy ordinary women. Their parents choose one man for them, they marry him and have children without hesitation, and then they live their lives, eventually dying in their children's care. After hearing this, the young geisha would often comment, the elder sister's stories are good, but we can't let them make us bitter and pessimistic. About 10 years ago, when the old geisha had finally accumulated enough wealth from years of hard work and had gained the freedom to choose her duties at the parlor, she began to long for a more conventional and healthy life. One of the signs of this shift was when she separated her living space from the parlor. She had the back entrance to her house, which was connected to the back alley, made separate from the front entrance leading to the main street. Another sign was when she adopted a distant relative's child, enrolling her in a girls' school. Her interest in newer, more intellectual pastimes also reflected this change in lifestyle. It was through an introduction from a friend in the lower town that she began studying waka, traditional Japanese poetry, with the author of this story. During that time, she expressed the following sentiment. A geisha is like a versatile knife, it doesn't need to be especially sharp, but it must be useful for a variety of tasks. I would like to learn just that level of skill. Recently, due to my age and appearance, I've been spending more time with more refined, upscale customers. The author spent about a year trying to teach the older woman, who was several years older than him. It became clear that while she didn't have a natural talent for waka, she was more suited to haiku. Eventually, she was introduced to a female haiku poet, and as a gesture of thanks for the lessons, the old geisha sent a craftsman to the author's home, where he built a small pond and fountain in the traditional lower town style. When the old geisha renovated her house in a blend of Western and Japanese styles, installing modern electrical systems, it was likely influenced by her competitive nature and the way the establishments she worked for were outfitted. After setting up the new systems, she was struck by the mysterious and almost mystical quality of the modern devices. When water was poured into the electric kettle, it quickly turned to steam and exited the spout with a hiss. Or when she pressed a pipe to light a cigarette, the electric lighter immediately sparked to life. Using these modern conveniences, she marveled at the way they worked, feeling as if they were alive. It's like they have a life of their own. Things should always work this way. This feeling of wonder brought her to reflect on her own life. What we've been doing was like turning a lantern on and off, a half-dreaming existence. Though she was somewhat exasperated by the cost of these new appliances, she looked forward to fiddling with them. For a while, she woke up early every morning, almost like a child. The electrical devices had often malfunctioned. The owner of the nearby electrical equipment store, Makita, came to repair them. She watched closely, intrigued by the process, and over time, absorbed some basic knowledge about electricity. When negative and positive electricity combine, they create various effects. That's just like human compatibility, isn't it? Her amazement at technology deepened even further. In a house full of women, there were often tasks that required a man's help. For this reason, Makita frequently visited, also assisting with some financial matters. One day, he brought a young man with him, introducing him as the person who would take over the electrical work. His name was Yuki. He was a lively, carefree young man who, while looking around the house, remarked, "There's no shamisen here, for a geisha house." As he visited often, his easygoing manner and the vibrant energy that seemed to repel others gradually became a source of fascination for the old geisha, and she began using this phrase about him. "Yuki's work is half-hearted. There's never been a case where it lasted more than a week." "Well, of course," he replied, "such boring work doesn't stir up any passion." "Passion? What's that?" she asked. "Passion? Well, I guess you could say it's when the feeling of interest just isn't there." Suddenly, the old geisha felt a sense of pity for her own life. She reflected on the many years spent in the parlors, never feeling the kind of passion Yuki spoke of. "I see," she said, "then, what kind of work would stir your passion?" The young man explained that he wanted to invent something, secure a patent, and make money. "Well then, why don't you just do that?" she urged. Yuki looked up at her. "Do it, you say? Things aren't that simple." He clicked his tongue here. "That's why people like you are called playgirls." "No, that's not it," she responded. "Now that you've brought it up, I'm willing to help. I'll take care of the living expenses, so go ahead and try as hard as you can." Thus, Yuki moved from Makita's shop to one of the old geisha's houses. She followed his suggestion and turned part of the house into a workshop, even purchasing some research equipment for him. Since his childhood, Yuki had worked hard to graduate from an electrical school, but with a clear purpose in mind. He avoided becoming a salaried employee bound by routine. Instead, he worked as a day laborer, moving from one electrical store to another. However, he was eventually drawn in by Makita, who was a senior from his middle school days and a man with a strong inclination to help others. For a time, he helped out at Makita's store and moved in with him. But the Makita household was large, with many children, and there was a constant flow of small, tedious tasks. Yuki soon became weary of it, and so he accepted the old geisha's offer of support. However, he didn't feel particularly grateful for it. He thought that an aging, former prostitute who had made her fortune by squeezing money out of men, and who was now trying to atone for her past by helping others, would probably want to do this kind of thing for anyone. While he didn't have the audacity to think of himself as doing her a favor, he didn't feel burdened by her kindness either. For the first time in his life, Yuki no longer had to worry about daily sustenance. He could fully focus on his books and the results of his experiments, trying to incorporate whatever he could use into his work, aiming to create something that the world didn't yet have. His quiet, purposeful lifestyle was a form of happiness. Dressed in a hemp blouse, his body appeared solid, and his head was shaved close with a hot iron. He would recline at an angle in his chair, cigarette smoke curling up around him. When he looked at himself in the mirror on the wall, he thought he appeared like a different person, a fitting image of a young inventor. The workshop had a surrounding veranda, and the long rectangular garden had a few plants. When he grew tired of work, Yuki would lie back on the veranda, gazing up at the slightly murky city sky, his thoughts drifting into daydreams. Every few days, the old geisha would visit him. She'd examine the house, taking note of areas where he seemed to be struggling, and then later have someone from her own household bring what was needed. "You're an easy person to care for someone so young. The house is always neat, and there's not a speck of dirt anywhere." "Well, that's because my mother died early, and since I was a baby, I've washed my own diapers and taken care of myself." The old geisha laughed, then grew serious and said, "But you know, a man who pays too much attention to the small details can't ever amount to much, can he? I wasn't born this way, but I've just gotten used to it over time. If I notice any slackness in myself, it makes me uneasy. I don't know why, but if there's something you need, don't hesitate to ask. Just say it, and I'll get it for you," she said kindly. On the day of the first rice of spring, Hatsumama, they would order an inari sushi and eat it in a relaxed, almost mother-daughter way. Her adopted daughter, Michiko, was capricious. She started coming almost every day and tried to get Yuki to play with her. Growing up in a society where emotional matters were treated like commodities, no matter how much her foster mother tried to shield her, it was impossible for those commodified emotions not to seep into her own feelings. Michiko had matured early, and though she had learned about these emotions in a formal way, they were not something she had genuinely felt. She had bypassed the stage of youth, her heart remaining like a child's, with only a thin layer of adult discernment added to her surface. Yuki, however, was not interested in such games. Michiko stopped visiting for a while after her attempts failed to engage him, only returning after a long pause. She felt as though she had to make use of a young man in the house, as if it would be a waste not to. She resented that her foster mother had brought someone into their home without any real connection to them. One day, Michiko sat carelessly on Yuki's lap. "Maintaining the outward form of a refined lady," she said. "Why don't you check how much I weigh?" Yuki lifted his knees a few times, then said, "For someone of marriageable age, you lack emotional refinement." Michiko, perhaps misunderstanding or purposely misinterpreting his use of the word emotional, responded, "That's not true. I got an A for my conduct points at school." Yuki felt a strange amusement as he assessed her body through her clothes, as though he had discovered a malnourished child trying to act like a full-grown woman. He chuckled involuntarily. "That's quite rude," Michiko said. "Well, at least try some exercise and maybe you'll end up with a body like your mother's," Yuki suggested lightly. After that, for reasons unknown to him, Michiko began harboring a deep resentment toward Yuki. For about half a year, Yuki's happiness continued. However, after that, he began to feel vaguely disoriented. While his imagined inventions seemed wonderful at first, once it came to actually testing and researching them, he discovered that many similar inventions had already been patented. Even if his own ideas were far more advanced, to avoid conflicts with existing patents, he had to change the design significantly. Moreover, doubts arose about whether such inventions would even be needed in society. In fact, while experts might recognize the value of a good invention, sometimes what seems like a trivial idea can be a huge success, while truly great inventions go unnoticed. Yuki knew well that invention always involved speculation, but he never expected the process to be so far from what he had imagined. However, What truly led to Yuki's loss of enthusiasm for this life was his own inner feelings. When he had worked for others, he had dreamed of the joy of dedicating himself fully to his inventions, free from the worries of daily life. But now that he had the freedom he longed for, it turned out to be monotonous and bitter. At times, when the silence was too much, and he was pursuing his ideas alone without consulting anyone, he began to fear that he might be heading in the wrong direction, isolated from society. Even regarding money-making, doubts emerged. Now that his life no longer had financial worries, his distractions consisted of simple pleasures: going to the movies, stopping by a tavern, enjoying a slight buzz, and taking a cab home. This was enough for him. Furthermore, old geisha, the foster mother, was happy to support these small indulgences. This was enough for Yuki to be satisfied. He had been invited a couple of times by his colleagues to indulge in the pleasures of women, but he never felt any real desire beyond the transaction. Instead, he longed to return to his own home, where he could live freely and sleep in a bed of his own choosing. Even when he went out, he never spent the night elsewhere. He had even made his own bedding, including down comforters, buying the feathers himself from a bird shop and crafting them with his own hands. No matter how much he searched, Yuki could not find any further desires within himself. He discovered that he had become strangely neutralized, and this realization made him feel cold at heart. He even began to wonder whether he had become a pervert, given that he was at the age when such feelings were expected to be part of youth. In contrast, what kind of woman was that old geisha? She had a melancholic expression, yet there was a hidden, strong core within her. Even in something as mundane as practicing an art, she would devour and absorb one unknown thing after another, always seeking more. Constantly driven by a mixture of satisfaction and dissatisfaction, she was propelled forward. When the old geisha came by again, Yuki brought up a topic of conversation. "Do you know about the French Revue actress, Mistinge?" "Oh, yes, I know. I've heard her records. That rhythm is quite something. There's a rumor that she has stored all the wrinkles of her body in the soles of her feet, but I don't think you'll need to do that anytime soon." The old geisha's eyes flashed dangerously, but she immediately smiled and said, "Me? Well, I've added quite a few years to my age, and I probably won't be the same as I was before, but let's try." With that, the old geisha rolled up the sleeve of her left arm and thrust it toward Yuki. "Why don't you try pinching the skin on my arm with your thumb and forefinger as hard as you can?" Yuki did as instructed. After he pinched her arm, the old geisha took her opposite arm and pinched the skin there with her right fingers, pulling. The skin between Yuki's fingers slid smoothly and quickly back into place, returning to the original form of her arm. Yuki tried again with more force, but as soon as the old geisha pulled, the skin slipped away, and he could no longer hold onto it. The sensation of smooth, slippery skin, as strong as the belly of an eel and as white as parchment, lingered in Yuki's senses. "That's disgusting. But I'm surprised." The old geisha wiped away the bloodstains from the pinched skin with the sleeve of her crepe kimono, then tucked her arm back into place. "It's thanks to the dancing I was forced into when I was young, being beaten and slapped during my training." However, recalling the hardships of her childhood, her face turned somber. "Tell me, what about you? How have you been lately?" The old geisha studied Yuki for a moment before speaking again. "I'm not saying you should study harder or succeed quickly. But it feels like your spirit is getting weaker. It's as if you're a fish whose vitality has faded. What do you think?" Yuki, admiring her sharp insight, honestly confessed. It's no good, I've lost all interest in the world. No, perhaps I was born this way, with no interest from the start, Yuki said. That might not be the case, but if it were, it would be troubling. You've gained weight, though. You've changed a lot, the old geisha replied. Indeed, Yuki, who had originally been well-built, had started to gain weight, his body swelling slightly, becoming more refined and boyish in appearance. The swelling of his upper eyelids and the double chin on his jaw added a touch of fullness and a certain sheen to his face. Yeah, my body's in good shape, and just doing nothing gives me a pleasant, languid feeling. If I don't stay sharp, I forget the things I should be paying attention to right away. But that's the problem, I'm always anxious. This is the first time I've felt like this, Yuki explained. Maybe it's because you've been eating too much barley porridge, the old geisha teased, knowing that Yuki often ordered barley rice and yam from a nearby shop that advertised it. But she quickly became serious and added, when that happens, you just need to find something to worry about, something to make you work hard. Everyone has their share of struggles, but they come in manageable amounts. A few days later, the old geisha invited Yuki to go out. Along with them were Michiko and two young geisha, whom Yuki had never met before, not associated with the old geisha's house. The young geisha were dressed in modest but elegant attire, and they politely thanked the old geisha, saying, "Thank you, sister, for today." The old geisha explained to Yuki, "Today, we're having a little party to lift your spirits. I've already paid for the travel expenses of these geisha, so just think of yourself as the host and enjoy yourself without reservation." Indeed, the two young geisha worked diligently. As they crossed the bamboo ferry, the younger one asked Yuki, "Please, take my hand for a moment," and, as they moved onto the boat, she deliberately stumbled and clung to Yuki's back, almost as though she were embracing him. The scent of scented oil reached Yuki's nose, and in front of him, the full, white neck of the geisha peeked out from beneath the red lining of her collar, her hairline faintly blue against the nape, as though thrust toward him. Her face was slightly turned, powdered thickly, and her high cheekbones glistened like white enamel, with the clear shape of her nose visible like a sculpture. The old geisha sat on the partition of the boat, reaching into her obi to pull out a cigarette case and lighter. "What a beautiful view," she remarked. They traveled by taxi and on foot, exploring the early summer scenery along the Arakawa flood control channel. Factories had proliferated, and company housing lined the streets, though the old areas like Kanegafuchi and Ayase, once familiar, had been replaced by patches of cold dust-covered ground. The famous mimosa trees of Ayase River were now only a few remnants, and on the opposite bank, boat carpenters were still working. The old geisha reflected, "When I was kept in a dormitory on Mukojima, my husband was terribly jealous. He wouldn't let me go out of this area. So I would say I was going for a walk around here, but he would dress as a fisherman and tie his boat under the shade of these mimosa trees by the embankment. That's where we used to meet secretly. As evening came, the buds of the mimosa flowers began to bloom, and the sound of the boatwright's hammer gradually faded. A pale, bluish mist hung over the river. We once had a discussion about committing double suicide," the old geisha said. "After all, it was a matter of just stepping over the gunwale, and it could have been done in a moment, so it was a bit dangerous." "Why did you decide against it?" Yuki asked, imagining the despair of young lovers. "Every time we met, we'd discuss when we might die, but somehow it kept getting delayed. Then one day, a body from a double suicide, a Toseman, was carried down the river. From the crowd, we looked closely, and the man said, "Double suicide is a disgrace, let's not do it." I began to think that while it might be fine for him to die, it would be pitiful for the husband left behind. No matter how terrible a man is, when he's that jealous, there's something that stays in your heart after it's all over. The young geisha remarked, "When we listen to stories from your time, sis, we feel like our work today is all about greed and competition, and we get so disgusted." But the old geisha waved her hand. "No, that's not it," she said. "This time has its own good points. Everything is faster now, almost like electricity, and there are so many ways to do things. It's interesting." After these words, the older geisha began to take care of the younger ones, frequently teasing Yuki in a playful and coquettish manner. As for Michiko, she seemed oddly unsettled. Initially, she kept a detached, almost disdainful attitude, walking away and taking photos with a Leica camera, but soon she became overly familiar with Yuki, trying to win his favor and clearly displaying her intention to outshine the other geisha. In such moments, Yuki couldn't help but notice a subtle, almost animal-like sensuality in her, reminiscent of a sickly bird or the tenderness of raw meat, which inexplicably triggered a reaction in his senses, making him involuntarily inhale deeply. Yet, it was fleeting, and nothing penetrated his heart. The younger geisha seemed displeased by Michiko's challenge, but since she was the older geisha's adopted daughter, they avoided making a fuss, professionally refraining from competing too much. As soon as Michiko let her guard down, they resumed their attentions to Yuki. For Michiko, it felt like flies swarming over her own sweets. She seemed to try and vent her dissatisfaction by confronting the old geisha. In the passage, the old geisha remains calm and unbothered, leisurely picking chickweed for the canaries or enjoying a beer with boiled burdock root as a snack in a iris garden. As evening sets in, the group prepares to head to a restaurant for dinner. At this point, Michiko, after giving Yuki a sharp glance, announces that she wants to return home alone and have a simple rice meal. The younger geisha express surprise and offer to send her home, but the old geisha, laughing, waves them off, calling for a passing car to take her. As the car drives away, the old geisha comments, "That girl has learned a little bit about pretending to be sophisticated." This moment reflects the dynamics of the group, with the old geisha being nonchalant and seeing through the younger geisha's behavior. Michiko's attempt to appear independent or different is noted, with the old geisha subtly acknowledging it. There's an air of experience in the old geisha's observations, showing her awareness of the younger woman's efforts to manipulate perceptions. Yuki gradually stopped understanding the actions of the old courtesan. At first, he thought she might be taking care of young people to distract herself, as atonement for her past sins with men, but that didn't seem to be the case. Recently, rumors had started to spread around this area, and although there was clearly no sign of the old courtesan being interested in a young man named Tsubame, she didn't show any signs of affection toward him either. Why would she treat a grown man so boldly? Yuki hadn't entered the workshop at all lately, and he had abandoned his invention ideas. The old courtesan, who knew this, didn't say a word about it, and because of that, Yuki's doubts about her intentions grew. From the glass window facing the veranda, he could see into the workshop, so he tried to avoid looking, instead lying on his back on the veranda. The ancient trees in the garden were putting forth fresh green leaves as summer approached, and the azalea flowers, which grew from the remaining stones in the pond's shore, were attracting flies. The sky was deeply blue, and the clouds, like those over a continent, were slowly moving, their colors tinged with a hint of rain. A paulownia tree was in bloom in the shadow of the next-door dried goods shop. Yuki thought back to his past when he worked in various houses. He recalled sticking his head into the corners of cabinets that smelled of soy sauce barrels, doing cramped work, or sharing meals with housewives and maids during lunchtime. Those things he once hated now seemed strangely nostalgic. In the narrow second floor of Makita's house, when he was making design budgets for orders, children would come one by one and cling to him until his neck muscles swelled. They would take candy from their small mouths, push it into their own mouths while still drooling. He started to think that perhaps he didn't want something as grand as an invention, but rather a normal life. Suddenly, Michiko came to his mind. The old courtesan, from her high perch, appeared to watch them indifferently, but perhaps, if possible, she intended to make him Michiko's husband and have him take care of her in her old age. However, it was hard to be sure. The old courtesan, who was so proud, wouldn't likely entertain such petty plans or show affection to anyone in that way. When he thought of Michiko, he remembered her as a daughter whose outward appearance was perfectly arranged, but whose inner self lacked substance. He couldn't help but picture her as a boiled chestnut with a watery, mushy interior, which made him chuckle bitterly. Recently, though, Michiko's attitude towards him seemed odd. She seemed to have some kind of hatred or resentment, yet she was persistently sticking around. Her visits had become more regular, not out of whim, but rather as if she was coming every day or two. Michiko entered through the back door. She opened the sliding door between the 4.5 tatami mat room and the 12 tatami mat guest room, which was divided off from the sitting room and workshop. She stood on the threshold, leaning one hand on the pillar, twisting her body slightly to show a coquettish pose, and slipped her other hand under the wide sleeve of her kimono, striking a pose like someone about to have their photo taken. Looking downward with a slightly sullen expression, she peered over her forehead and said, "I've come." Yuki, lying on the veranda, simply replied, Michiko tried again, saying the same thing, but when she received the same answer, she really became irritated and said, "What a lazy, indifferent response. I'm never coming again." "You're such a selfish, capricious girl," Yuki said, propping himself up while crossing his legs in a lotus position. "Oh. You're wearing your hair in a traditional Japanese style today." He looked her up and down. "I don't know," Michiko said, turning her back and making an exaggerated, slumped posture with her kimono. Yuki observed her. The decorative knot of her elegant obi was at the top, just beneath the collar of her kimono, exposing the nape of her neck in an exaggeratedly seductive manner. But compared to that, her waist and hem below the obi were sharply trimmed, like the single flower of a young girl, unadorned and simple. He stared at her with an odd fascination, imagining what it would be like if this girl were his wife, someone who would trust him with everything, rely on him for everything, and be a bit of a bother, always taking care of him. He imagined that his life would settle into a quiet, uneventful routine, and though there was a certain loneliness in that idea, there was also a strange and unfamiliar anticipation for an unknown future that tugged at his current emotions. Yuki looked at Michiko's small face, made up with overly perfect, formal beauty, her hair styled meticulously, and wanted to find even more charm that would captivate him. "Turn around again and look at me. It really suits you," he said. Michiko shrugged her right shoulder slightly but quickly turned around, adjusting her hair and the decorative pin at her chest and temples. "You're so noisy," she said, pleased that Yuki was really looking at her. She let the dangling end of the ornament sway as she spoke. "I brought you a treat. Guess what it is?" Yuki, feeling irritated and unsure if this young girl had seen through the sweetness of being teased by her, replied, "Guessing is a hassle. If you've brought it, hurry up and show it." Michiko, immediately rebelling against his authoritative tone, said, "If you're going to act so arrogantly about something I brought out of kindness, then I won't bring it again." She turned her body sideways. "Show it," Yuki said as he stood up. Surprised by his own actions, he took on the stance of an authority figure, puffing himself up as he slowly moved toward Michiko. The danger of trapping his entire life into a small, confined space and the inexplicable pull of an unknown force that made him head toward something dangerous, the feeling of walking willingly toward a dead end, evoked an extreme sense of tension in him for the first time. Struggling to avoid being overwhelmed by self-loathing, beads of cold sweat trickled down his forehead. At first, Michiko thought his behavior was just another joke, his way of continuing his domineering act. But as his actions grew more serious, she suddenly became frightened. Stepping back slightly toward the sitting room, she muttered softly, "Who's going to show it?" But as Yuki stared at her with burning eyes, his hands slowly emerged from his pockets, and he draped them over her shoulders. In sheer terror, she let out a small scream twice, and her unadorned face revealed her emotions, her eyes, nose, and mouth scattered in a distorted expression. "Show it," Yuki repeated. "Hurry up and show it." The words themselves were empty, but the intense, cold tremor from his arms radiated through her. She felt the slow, deliberate swallowing of saliva as Yuki's large Adam's apple moved. She opened her eyes wide, feeling as though they might tear apart, and in a tearful voice, said, "I'm sorry." But Yuki, like someone shocked by electricity, remained motionless, his face frozen, pale, and only the tremors from his hands grew more intense as they passed through Michiko's body. At that moment, Michiko finally understood something from Yuki. She suddenly recalled her foster mother's words, "Men are surprisingly timid." Thinking about how a full-grown man was battling fear over something like this, she began to feel that Yuki was somehow endearing, like a large, good-natured animal. She quickly reassembled the scattered elements of her expression and turned it into a charming, coquettish smile. "Fool, stop that. I'll give you a treat." She brushed the sweat from his forehead with her hand and said, "It's over here. Come on." After glancing at the blue storm rustling through the garden trees, she took hold of Yuki's sturdy arm. On an evening when the early summer rain fell like smoke, the old courtesan opened her umbrella and entered the garden through the small cedar door next to the entrance. Dressed in a modest sitting kimono, she climbed into the room, lowered the hem of her kimono, and sat down. "I'm just about to leave the sitting room, but I stopped by because there's something I need to tell you," she said. She took out a tobacco pouch, drew her pipe, and used a Western-style plate as an ashtray. "Recently, Michiko has been coming over quite often." "Well, I'm not saying anything about that," she continued. "But you know, with young people, there are things that could happen, and she might not be aware of them. That might part," she added. "If it's true love, where both hearts are truly in sync and they're deeply in love with each other, I'd be all for it," she said with a tone of agreement. "But if it's just a fleeting attraction, a chance encounter where things end up happening, that's common enough in the world, and it's pointless. It won't necessarily happen with Michiko either. I've spent my whole life struggling with such things. If that's the case, it'll just keep happening over and over." She paused, as if considering something deeply. "Whether it's work or relationships, I want to see a pure, devoted effort without any hesitation or distractions," she said. "I've seen such dedication up close, and I would honestly prefer to die after seeing it. There's no need to rush or get impatient. Whether it's work or love, don't waste time. Go after what you want with full dedication, leaving no regrets, she concluded. Yuki laughed lightly, saying, in these times, such pure things are either impossible or don't even exist. The old courtesan laughed too. Well, it's rare in any era if you don't put your heart into it. So, take your time. If you like her, take it slow, eat some barley and yam, and carefully consider the nature of your fate. Fortunately, your health seems good. You probably have the stamina to last, she said with a smile. A carriage arrived to pick her up, and the old courtesan left. That evening, Yuki wandered off on a journey. He had come to understand the old courtesan's will. She was trying to make him do what she herself could not. However, what she was trying to make him do, things she couldn't do herself, was, for both her and him, something that no matter how lucky a person might be, would be impossible to accomplish in reality. Reality, it seemed, always gave fragments but never the whole picture, constantly luring people with fleeting glimpses. Yuki could always accept this. But the old courtesan didn't know how to give up. In that sense, she had a certain lack of sensitivity. Yet, in some cases, a lack of sensitivity could become a strength. What an extraordinary old woman, Yuki thought in surprise. It almost seemed as if she were transforming, like a shell shedding its outer layers. He was struck by a sense of tragic grandeur, yet he also had an unpleasant feeling of being pulled into her reckless scheme. If possible, he wanted to avoid the escalator of fate she was attempting to place him on and slip into a quiet life, like a hand-sewn feather quilt. To sort out these thoughts, he had come to a seaside inn, about 2 hours by train from Tokyo. It was an inn run by Mikita's brother, and he had been there once before to check the electrical equipment at Mikita's request. The inn faced the vast sea, with mountains in the distance, their clouds constantly passing by. He had never before come to a place like this to reflect and gather his thoughts. Perhaps because of the good air, the fresh fish was delicious, and the sea breeze was refreshing. From inside the inn, peals of laughter often rose up. The first thing that struck him as amusing was how the old woman, drawn to such boundless longing, lived a cramped, ordinary life without realizing it. He then thought about how certain animals, once bound by their surroundings, couldn't escape their confines, no matter how much they might try. Even here, at the inn, he couldn't escape the atmosphere of the old courtesan. While being enclosed in it felt heavy and dull, leaving it made him feel lonely. Thus, he thought it strange that, on the deepest level, he had chosen this specific destination as a form of escape, despite the fact that it was clear what he was trying to do. His relationship with Michiko was also strange. He couldn't understand it fully, but they had once brushed past each other like a lightning strike. After about a week's stay, Mikita, the shopkeeper from the electrical equipment store, came to pick him up with money, having been sent by the old courtesan. Mikita said, "There must have been some boring moments. You should quickly find a way to earn and become independent." Yuki was taken back home. However, after this, he noticed that he had developed a recurring tendency to run away. "Mother," Yuki ran away again, Michiko, the adopted daughter dressed in athletic wear, said as she stood at the entrance to the storeroom. She had a somewhat ironic satisfaction in seeing her foster mother disturbed, disregarding her own feelings. "He hasn't come home last night or the night before." After the teacher of new Japanese music had left, the old courtesan, who had remained alone in the small tatami-covered room in the earthen storeroom used for practice, placed her shamisen down. She didn't show any sign of the frustration rising within her, and with an unaffected expression, she turned to her adopted daughter. "That man. His usual habit has come out again." She took a puff of her long pipe and, with her left hand, tugged at the sleeve of her robe, spreading it out as though she were assessing whether the masculine stripes of her Oshima cloth suited her or not. After a moment, she said, "Just leave him be. We can't afford to be too soft on him." She then patted the ash off her knee and slowly began putting away the music score. Michiko, not seeming bothered by her foster mother's calm reaction, made a face as if to say it didn't matter, and took her racket to go out to the nearby court. Immediately afterward, the old courtesan called the electrical equipment shop and, as usual, asked Makita to look for Yuki. Her voice, directed at the unreserved recipient of the call, carried a sharpness of reprimand for the young man she was taking care of, a sharpness that resonated through the receiver into her own hand. But inside, a slight emotional fermentation of anxious unease mixed with a sense of loneliness, stimulating her mind. After hanging up, she muttered, "Young people really have energy, don't they? That's how it should be," as she dabbed her eye with her sleeve. Each time Yuki ran away, the old courtesan found herself feeling a sense of respect for him. Yet, when she imagined that he might not come back, she felt, as she always did, that it would be irreparable. In the middle of summer, the old courtesan, who was supposed to have been introduced to a woman and was studying haiku, sent an unusually rare poem of waka for revision to the author of this story. At the time, the author, coincidentally, was enjoying a post-meal breeze on the porch, gazing at the fountain in the courtyard pond that the old courtesan had once given him as a token of appreciation for her instruction in waka. He received the poem through an intermediary and, while listening to the sound of the pond's water, examined the courtesan's verse with great curiosity, being thrilled to receive her composition after such a long time. Among the poems, one stood out, reflecting the recent state of mind of the old courtesan, which is introduced here. Although I made some minor edits to the original, this was not so much out of a desire to alter the disciple's craft, but to ensure clearer communication for the reader. The changes were strictly confined to matters of rhetoric, guaranteeing that the essence of the original poem remains untouched. Year by year, my sorrow deepens. And yet, life blooms ever more brightly.